Why are you afraid of those fowls? They are condors and of the largest size. Should they attack us? Well, if they do, we'll defend ourselves. We have a whole arsenal at our disposal. I don't think those birds are so very formidable. Who can tell, was the doctor's only remark. 10 minutes later, the flock had come within gunshot, and were making the air ring with their hoarse cries. They came right toward the Victoria, more irritated than frightened by her presence. How they scream, what a noise, said Joe. Perhaps they don't like to see anybody poaching in their country up in the air, or daring to fly like themselves. Well, now, to tell the truth, when I take a good look at them, they are an ugly, ferocious set, and I should think them dangerous enough if they were armed with Purdymore rifles, admitted Kennedy. They have no need of such weapons, said Ferguson, looking very grave. The condors flew around them in wide circles, their flight growing gradually closer and closer to the balloon. They swept through the air in rapid, fantastic curves, occasionally precipitating themselves headlong with the speed of a bullet, and then breaking their line of projection by an abrupt and daring angle. The doctor, much disquieted, resolved to ascend so as to escape this dangerous proximity. He therefore dilated the hydrogen in his balloon, and it rapidly rose. But the condors mounted with him, apparently determined not to part company. They seemed to mean mischief, said the hunter, cocking his rifle. And in fact they were swooping nearer, and more than one came within 50 feet of them, as if defying the firearms. By George, I'm itching to let them have it, exclaimed Kennedy. No, Dick, not now, don't exasperate them needlessly. That would only be exciting them to attack us. But I could soon settle those fellows. You may think so, Dick, but you are wrong. Why, we have a bullet for each of them. And suppose that they were to attack the upper part of the balloon, what would you do? How would you get at them? Just imagine yourself in the presence of a troop of lions on the plain, or a school of sharks in the open ocean. For travelers in the air, this situation is just as dangerous. Are you speaking seriously, Doctor? Very seriously, Dick. Let us wait, then. Wait, hold yourself in readiness in case of an attack, but do not fire without my orders. The birds then collected at a short distance, yet so near that their naked necks, entirely bare of feathers, could be plainly seen, as they stretched them out with the effort of their cries, while their gristly crests, garnished with a comb and gills of deep violet, stood erect with rage. They were of the very largest size, their bodies being more than 3 feet in length, and the lower surface of their white wings glittering in the sunlight. They might well have been considered winged sharks, so striking was their resemblance to those ferocious rangers of the deep. They are following us, said the doctor as he saw them ascending with him, and mount as we may, they can fly still higher. Well, what are we to do? Asked Kennedy. The doctor made no answer. Listen, Samuel, said the sportsman. There are 14 of those birds. We have 17 shots at our disposal if we discharge all our weapons. Have we not the means, then, to destroy them or disperse them? I will give a good account of some of them. I have no doubt of your skill, Dick. I look upon all as dead that may come within range of your rifle, but I repeat that, if they attack the upper part of the balloon, you could not get a sight at them. They would tear the silk covering that sustains us, and we are 3,000 feet up in the air. At this moment, one of the ferocious birds darted right at the balloon, with outstretched beak and claws, ready to rend it with either or both. Fire, fire at once, cried the doctor. He had scarcely ceased, ere the huge creature, stricken dead, dropped headlong, turning over and over in space as he fell. Kennedy had already grasped one of the 2-barreled fowling pieces, and Joe was taking aim with another. Frightened by the report, the condors drew back for a moment, but they almost instantly returned to the charge with extreme fury. Kennedy severed the head of one from its body with his first shot, and Joe broke the wing of another. Only 11 left, said he. Thereupon the birds changed their tactics, and by common consent soared above the balloon. Kennedy glanced at Ferguson. The latter, in spite of his imperturbability, grew pale. Then ensued a moment of terrifying silence. In the next they heard a harsh tearing noise, as of something rending the silk, and the car seemed to sink from beneath the feet of our 3 aeronauts. We are lost, exclaimed Ferguson, glancing at the barometer, which was now swiftly rising. Over with the ballast, he shouted, over with it. and in a few seconds the last lumps of quartz had disappeared. "We are still falling. Empty the water tanks. Do you hear me, Joe? We are pitching into the lake." Joe obeyed. The doctor leaned over and looked out. The lake seemed to come up toward him like a rising tide. Every object around grew rapidly in size while they were looking at it. The car was not 200 feet from the surface of Lake Teachad. The provisions, cried the doctor, and the box containing them was launched into space. Their descent became less rapid, but the luckless aeronauts were still falling and into the lake. "Throw out something more," cried the doctor. "There is nothing more to throw," was Kennedy's despairing response. "Yes, there is," called Joe, and with a wave of the hand he disappeared like a flash, over the edge of the car. "Joe," exclaimed the doctor, horror-stricken. The Victoria, thus relieved, resumed her ascending motion, mounted 1,000 feet into the air, and the wind, burying itself in the disinflated covering, bore them away toward the northern part of the lake. "Lost," exclaimed the sportsman with a gesture of despair. "Lost to save us," responded Ferguson. And these men, intrepid as they were, felt the large tears streaming down their cheeks. They leaned over with the vain hope of seeing some trace of their heroic companion, but they were already far away from him. "What course shall we pursue?" asked Kennedy. "Alight as soon as possible, Dick, and then wait." After a sweep of some 60 miles, the Victoria halted on a desert shore on the north of the lake. The anchors caught in a low tree and the sportsman fastened it securely. Night came, but neither Ferguson nor Kennedy could find one moment's sleep. Chapter 33. Conjectures, re-establishment of the Victoria's equilibrium, Dr. Ferguson's new calculations, Kennedy's hunt, a complete exploration of Lake Teachad, Tangalia, the return, Laurie. On the morrow, the 13th of May, our travellers, for the first time, reconnoitred the part of the coast on which they had landed. It was a sort of island of solid ground in the midst of an immense marsh. Around this fragment of terra firma grew reeds as lofty as trees are in Europe, and stretching away out of sight. These impenetrable swamps gave security to the position of the balloon. It was necessary to watch only the borders of the lake. The vast stretch of water broadened away from the spot, especially toward the east, and nothing could be seen on the horizon, neither mainland nor islands. The two friends had not yet ventured to speak of their recent companion. Kennedy first imparted his conjectures to the doctor. "Perhaps Joe is not lost after all," he said. "He was a skillful lad and had few equals as a swimmer. He would find no difficulty in swimming across the Firth of Forth at Edinburgh. We shall see him again, but how and where I know not. Let us omit nothing on our part to give him the chance of rejoining us." "May God grant it as you say, Dick," replied the doctor with much emotion. "We shall do everything in the world to find our lost friend again. Let us in the first place see where we are. But above all things, let us rid the Victoria of this outside covering which is of no further use. That will relieve us of £650, a weight not to be despised, and the end is worth the trouble." The doctor and Kennedy went to work at once, but they encountered great difficulty. They had to tear the strong silk away piece by piece, and then cut it in narrow strips so as to extricate it from the meshes of the network. The tier made by the beaks of the condors was found to be several feet in length. This operation took at least 4 hours, but at length the inner balloon, once completely extricated, did not appear to have suffered in the least degree. The Victoria was thus diminished in size by 1/5, and this difference was sufficiently noticeable to excite Kennedy's surprise. "Will it be large enough?" he asked. "Have no fears on that score. I will re-establish the equilibrium, and should our poor Joe return we shall find a way to start off with him again on our old route. At the moment of our fall, unless I am mistaken, we were not far from an island." "Yes, I recollect it," said the doctor, "but that island, like all the islands on Lake Teachad, is no doubt inhabited by a gang of pirates and murderers. They certainly witnessed our misfortune, and should Joe fall into their hands, what will become of him unless protected by their superstitions?" "Oh, he's just the lad to get safely out of the scrape, I repeat. I have great confidence in his shrewdness and skill." "I hope so. Now, Dick, you may go and hunt in the neighbourhood, but don't get far away whatever you do. It has become a pressing necessity for us to renew our stock of provisions, since we had to sacrifice nearly all the old lot." "Very good, Doctor, I shall not be long absent." Hereupon, Kennedy took a double-barreled fowling piece and strode through the long grass toward a thicket not far off, where the frequent sound of shooting soon let the doctor know that the sportsman was making a good use of his time. Meanwhile, Ferguson was engaged in calculating the relative weight of the articles still left in the car, and in establishing the equipoise of the second balloon. He found that there were still left some 30 pounds of pemmican, a supply of tea and coffee, about 1.5 gallons of brandy, and 1 empty water tank. All the dried meat had disappeared. The doctor was aware that, by the loss of the hydrogen in the first balloon, the ascensional force at his disposal was now reduced to about 900 pounds. He therefore had to count upon this difference in order to rearrange his equilibrium. The new balloon measured 67,000 cubic feet and contained 33,480 feet of gas. The dilating apparatus appeared to be in good condition, and neither the battery nor the spiral had been injured. The ascensional force of the new balloon was then about 3,000 pounds, and in adding together the weight of the apparatus, of the passengers, of the stock of water, of the car and its accessories, and putting aboard 50 gallons of water and 100 pounds of fresh meat, the doctor got a total weight of 2,830 pounds. He could then take with him 170 pounds of ballast for unforeseen emergencies, and the balloon would be in exact balance with the surrounding atmosphere. His arrangements were completed accordingly, and he made up for Joe's weight with a surplus of ballast. He spent the whole day in these preparations, and the latter were finished when Kennedy returned. The hunter had been successful, and brought back a regular cargo of geese, wild duck, snipe, teal, and plover. He went to work at once to draw and smoke the game. Each piece, suspended on a small, thin skewer, was hung over a fire of green wood. When they seemed in good order, Kennedy, who was perfectly at home in the business, packed them away in the car. On the morrow, the hunter was to complete his supplies. Evening surprised our travellers in the midst of this work. Their supper consisted of pemmican, biscuit, and tea, and fatigue after having given them appetite brought them sleep. Each of them strained eyes and ears into the gloom during his watch, sometimes fancying that they heard the voice of poor Joe, but alas, the voice that they so longed to hear was far away. At the first streak of day, the doctor aroused Kennedy. "I have been long and carefully considering what should be done," said he, "to find our companion." "Whatever your plan may be, doctor, it will suit me. Speak." "Above all things, it is important that Joe should hear from us in some way." "Undoubtedly. Suppose the brave fellow should take it into his head that we have abandoned him." He knows us too well for that. Such a thought would never come into his mind, but he must be informed as to where we are." "How can that be managed?" "We shall get into our car and be off again through the air." "But should the wind bear us away?" "Happily it will not. See, Dick, it is carrying us back to the lake, and this circumstance, which would have been vexatious yesterday, is fortunate now. Our efforts, then, will be limited to keeping ourselves above that vast sheet of water throughout the day. Joe cannot fail to see us, and his eyes will be constantly on the lookout in that direction. Perhaps he will even manage to let us know the place of his retreat. If he be alone and at liberty, he certainly will." "And if a prisoner," resumed the doctor, "it not being the practice of the natives to confine their captives, he will see us, and comprehend the object of our researches." "But at last," put in Kennedy, "for we must anticipate everything, should we find no trace, if he should have left no mark to follow him by, what are we to do?" "We shall endeavour to regain the northern part of the lake, keeping ourselves as much in sight as possible. There we'll wait, we'll explore the banks, we'll search the water's edge, for Joe will assuredly try to reach the shore, and we will not leave the country without having done everything to find him." "Let us set out then," said the hunter. The doctor hereupon took the exact bearings of the patch of solid land they were about to leave, and arrived at the conclusion that it lay on the north shore of Lake Teachad, between the village of Lari and the village of Ingemini, both visited by Major Denham. During this time Kennedy was completing his stock of fresh meat. Although the neighbouring marshes showed traces of the rhinoceros, the lamantine or manatee, and the hippopotamus, he had no opportunity to see a single specimen of those animals. At 7 in the morning, but not without great difficulty, which to Joe would have been nothing, the balloon's anchor was detached from its hold, the gas dilated, and the new Victoria rose 200 feet into the air. It seemed to hesitate at first and went spinning around like a top, but at last a brisk current caught it, and it advanced over the lake, and was soon borne away at a speed of 20 miles per hour. The doctor continued to keep at a height of from 200 to 500 feet. Kennedy frequently discharged his rifle, and when passing over islands, the aeronauts approached them even imprudently, scrutinizing the thickets, the bushes, the underbrush, in fine, every spot where a mass of shade or jutting rock could have afforded a retreat to their companion. They swooped down close to the long pirogues that navigated the lake, and the wild fishermen, terrified at the sight of the balloon, would plunge into the water and regain their islands with every symptom of undisguised affright. "We can see nothing," said Kennedy after 2 hours of search. "Let us wait a little longer, Dick, and not lose heart. We cannot be far away from the scene of our accident." By 11 o'clock the balloon had gone 90 miles. It then fell in with a new current, which, blowing almost at right angles to the other, drove them eastward about 60 miles. It next floated over a very large and populous island, which the doctor took to be Faram, on which the capital of the Bidyamas is situated. Ferguson expected at every moment to see Joe spring up out of some thicket, flying for his life and calling for help. Were he free, they could pick him up without trouble. Were he a prisoner, they could rescue him by repeating the maneuver they had practiced to save the missionary, and he would soon be with his friends again. But nothing was seen, not a sound was heard. The case seemed desperate. About 2:30, the Victoria hove in sight of Tangalia, a village situated on the eastern shore of Lake Tchad, where it marks the extreme point attained by Denham at the period of his exploration. The doctor became uneasy at this persistent setting of the wind in that direction, for he felt that he was being thrown back to the eastward, toward the center of Africa and the interminable deserts of that region. "We must absolutely come to a halt," said he, "and even alight. For Joe's sake particularly, we ought to go back to the lake, but to begin with let us endeavor to find an opposite current." During more than an hour he searched at different altitudes. The balloon always came back toward the mainland, but at length, at the height of 1,000 feet, a very violent breeze swept to the northwestward. It was out of the question that Joe should have been detained on one of the islands of the lake, for in such case he would certainly have found means to make his presence there known. Perhaps he had been dragged to the mainland. The doctor was reasoning thus to himself when he again came in sight of the northern shore of Lake Tchad. As for supposing that Joe had been drowned, that was not to be believed for a moment. One horrible thought glanced across the minds of both Kennedy and the doctor. Caimans swarm in these waters, but neither one nor the other had the courage to distinctly communicate this impression. However, it came up to them so forcibly at last that the doctor said, without further preface, "Crocodiles are found only on the shores of the islands or of the lake, and Joe will have skill enough to avoid them. Besides, they are not very dangerous, and the Africans bathe with impunity and quite fearless of their attacks." Kennedy made no reply. He preferred keeping quiet to discussing this terrible possibility. The doctor made out the town of Lari about 5 o'clock in the evening. The inhabitants were at work gathering in their cotton crop in front of their huts, constructed of woven reeds, and standing in the midst of clean and neatly kept enclosures. This collection of about 50 habitations occupied a slight depression of the soil, in a valley extending between two low mountains. The force of the wind carried the doctor farther onward than he wanted to go, but it changed a second time, and bore him back exactly to his starting point, on the sort of enclosed island where he had passed the preceding night. The anchor, instead of catching the branches of the tree, took hold in the masses of reeds mixed with the thick mud of the marshes, which offered considerable resistance. The doctor had much difficulty in restraining the balloon, but at length the wind died away with the setting in of nightfall, and the two friends kept watch together in an almost desperate state of mind. Chapter 34. The hurricane, a forced departure, loss of an anchor, melancholy reflections, the resolution adopted, the sandstorm, the buried caravan, a contrary yet favourable wind, the return southward, Kennedy at his post. At 3 o'clock in the morning the wind was raging. It beat down with such violence that the Victoria could not stay near the ground without danger. It was thrown almost flat over upon its side, and the reeds chafed the silk so roughly that it seemed as though they would tear it. "We must be off, Dick," said the doctor. "We cannot remain in this situation." "But, doctor, what of Joe?" "I am not likely to abandon him. No, indeed, and should the hurricane carry me 1,000 miles to the northward, I will return, but here we are endangering the safety of all." "Must we go without him?" asked the Scot with an accent of profound grief. "And do you think, then," rejoined Ferguson, That my heart does not bleed like your own? Am I not merely obeying an imperious necessity?" "I am entirely at your orders," replied the hunter. "Let us start." But their departure was surrounded with unusual difficulty. The anchor, which had caught very deeply, resisted all their efforts to disengage it, while the balloon, drawing in the opposite direction, increased its tension. Kennedy could not get it free. Besides, in his present position, the maneuver had become a very perilous one, for the Victoria threatened to break away before he should be able to get into the car again. The doctor, unwilling to run such a risk, made his friend get into his place, and resigned himself to the alternative of cutting the anchor rope. The Victoria made one bound of 300 feet into the air, and took her route directly northward. Ferguson had no other choice than to scud before the storm. He folded his arms, and soon became absorbed in his own melancholy reflections. After a few moments of profound silence, he turned to Kennedy, who sat there no less taciturn. "We have perhaps been tempting Providence," said he. "It does not belong to man to undertake such a journey," and a sigh of grief escaped him as he spoke. "It is but a few days," replied the sportsman, "since we were congratulating ourselves upon having escaped so many dangers. All three of us were shaking hands. Poor Joe, kindly and excellent disposition, brave and candid heart, dazzled for a moment by his sudden discovery of wealth, he willingly sacrificed his treasures, and now he is far from us, and the wind is carrying us still farther away with resistless speed. Come, doctor, admitting that he may have found refuge among the lake tribes, can he not do as the travellers who visited them before us did? Like Denham, like Barth, both of those men got back to their own country." "Ah, my dear Dick, Joe doesn't know one word of the language, he is alone and without resources. The travellers of whom you speak did not attempt to go forward without sending many presents in advance of them to the chiefs, and surrounded by an escort armed and trained for these expeditions. Yet they could not avoid sufferings of the worst description. What then can you expect the fate of our companion to be? It is horrible to think of, and this is one of the worst calamities that it has ever been my lot to endure." "But we'll come back again, doctor." "Come back, Dick. Yes, if we have to abandon the balloon, if we should be forced to return to Lake Tchad on foot and put ourselves in communication with the Sultan of Bornu. The Arabs cannot have retained a disagreeable remembrance of the first Europeans." "I will follow you, doctor," replied the hunter with emphasis. "You may count upon me. We would rather give up the idea of prosecuting this journey than not return. Joe forgot himself for our sake. We will sacrifice ourselves for his." This resolve revived some hope in the hearts of these two men. They felt strong in the same inspiration. Ferguson forthwith set everything at work to get into a contrary current that might bring him back again to Lake Tchad. But this was impracticable at that moment, and even to alight was out of the question on ground completely bare of trees, and with such a hurricane blowing. The Victoria thus passed over the country of the Tibus, crossed the Beled el Jerid, a desert of briars that forms the border of the Soudan, and advanced into the desert of sand, streaked with the long tracks of the many caravans that pass and repass there. The last line of vegetation was speedily lost in the dim southern horizon, not far from the principal oasis in this part of Africa, whose 50 wells are shaded by magnificent trees. But it was impossible to stop. An Arab encampment, tents of striped stuff, some camels stretching out their viper-like heads and necks along the sand, gave life to this solitude. But the Victoria sped by like a shooting star, and in this way traversed a distance of 60 miles in 3 hours, without Ferguson being able to check or guide her course. "We cannot halt, we cannot alight," said the doctor. "Not a tree, not an inequality of the ground. Are we then to be driven clear across Sahara? Surely heaven is indeed against us." He was uttering these words with a sort of despairing rage, when suddenly he saw the desert sands rising aloft in the midst of a dense cloud of dust, and go whirling through the air, impelled by opposing currents. Amid this tornado, an entire caravan, disorganized, broken, and overthrown, was disappearing beneath an avalanche of sand. The camels, flung pell-mell together, were uttering dull and pitiful groans. Cries and howls of despair were heard issuing from that dusty and stifling cloud, and from time to time, a party-colored garment cut the chaos of the scene with its vivid hues, and the moaning and shrieking sounded over all, a terrible accompaniment to this spectacle of destruction. Ere long the sand had accumulated in compact masses, and there, where so recently stretched a level plain as far as the eye could see, rose now a ridgy line of hillocks, still moving from beneath, the vast tomb of an entire caravan. The doctor and Kennedy, pallid with emotion, sat transfixed by this fearful spectacle. They could no longer manage their balloon, which went whirling round and round in contending currents, and refused to obey the different dilations of the gas. Caught in these eddies of the atmosphere, it spun about with a rapidity that made their heads reel, while the car oscillated and swung to and fro violently at the same time. The instruments suspended under the awning clattered together as though they would be dashed to pieces. The pipes of the spiral bent to and fro, threatening to break at every instant, and the water tanks jostled and jarred with tremendous din. Although but 2 feet apart, our aeronauts could not hear each other speak, but with firmly clinched hands they clung convulsively to the cordage and endeavored to steady themselves against the fury of the tempest. Kennedy, with his hair blown wildly about his face, looked on without speaking, but the doctor had regained all his daring in the midst of this deadly peril, and not a sign of his emotion was betrayed in his countenance, even when, after a last violent twirl, the Victoria stopped suddenly in the midst of a most unlooked-for calm. The north wind had abruptly got the upper hand, and now drove her back with equal rapidity over the route she had traversed in the morning. "Whither are we going now?" cried Kennedy. "Let us leave that to Providence, my dear Dick. I was wrong in doubting it. It knows better than we, and here we are, returning to places that we had expected never to see again." The surface of the country, which had looked so flat and level when they were coming, now seemed tossed and uneven like the ocean billows after a storm. A long succession of hillocks that had scarcely settled to their places yet indented the desert. The wind blew furiously, and the balloon fairly flew through the atmosphere. The direction taken by our aeronauts differed somewhat from that of the morning, and thus about 9 o'clock, instead of finding themselves again near the borders of Lake Teachad, they saw the desert still stretching away before them. Kennedy remarked the circumstance. "It matters little," replied the doctor. "The important point is to return southward. We shall come across the towns of Bornu, Wadi or Kuka, and I should not hesitate to halt there." "If you are satisfied, I am content," replied the Scot, "but heaven grant that we may not be reduced to cross the desert, as those unfortunate Arabs had to do. What we saw was frightful." "It often happens, Dick. These trips across the desert are far more perilous than those across the ocean. The desert has all the dangers of the sea, including the risk of being swallowed up, and added thereto are unendurable fatigues and privations. I think the wind shows some symptoms of moderating, the sand dust is less dense, the undulations of the surface are diminishing, and the sky is growing clearer. So much the better. We must now reconnoitre attentively with our glasses, and take care not to omit a single point." "I will look out for that, Doctor, and not a tree shall be seen without my informing you of it." And suiting the action to the word, Kennedy took his station, spyglass in hand, at the forward part of the car. Chapter 35. What happened to Joe? The island of the Bidyamas, the adoration shown him, the island that sank, the shores of the lake, the tree of the serpents, the foot tramp, terrible suffering, mosquitoes and ants, hunger, the Victoria seen, she disappears, the swamp, one last despairing cry. What had become of Joe, while his master was thus vainly seeking for him? When he had dashed headlong into the lake, his first movement on coming to the surface was to raise his eyes and look upward. He saw the Victoria already risen far above the water, still rapidly ascending and growing smaller and smaller. It was soon caught in a rapid current and disappeared to the northward. His master, both his friends were saved. "How lucky it was," thought he, "that I had that idea to throw myself out into the lake. Mr. Kennedy would soon have jumped at it, and he would not have hesitated to do as I did, for nothing's more natural than for one man to give himself up to save 2 others. That's mathematics." Satisfied on this point, Joe began to think of himself. He was in the middle of a vast lake, surrounded by tribes unknown to him and probably ferocious. All the greater reason why he should get out of the scrape by depending only on himself, and so he gave himself no farther concern about it. Before the attack by the birds of prey, which according to him had behaved like real condors, he had noticed an island on the horizon, and determining to reach it if possible, he put forth all his knowledge and skill in the art of swimming, after having relieved himself of the most troublesome part of his clothing. The idea of a stretch of 5 or 6 miles by no means disconcerted him, and therefore, so long as he was in the open lake, he thought only of striking out straight ahead and manfully. In about an hour and a half, the distance between him and the island had greatly diminished. But as he approached the land, a thought, at first fleeting and then tenacious, arose in his mind. He knew that the shores of the lake were frequented by huge alligators, and was well aware of the voracity of those monsters. Now, no matter how much he was inclined to find everything in this world quite natural, the worthy fellow was no little disturbed by this reflection. He feared greatly lest white flesh like his might be particularly acceptable to the dreaded brutes, and advanced only with extreme precaution, his eyes on the alert on both sides and all around him. At length, he was not more than 100 yards from a bank, covered with green trees, when a puff of air strongly impregnated with a musky odour reached him. "There," said he to himself, "just what I expected, the crocodile isn't far off." With this he dived swiftly, but not sufficiently so to avoid coming into contact with an enormous body, the scaly surface of which scratched him as he passed. He thought himself lost and swam with desperate energy. Then he rose again to the top of the water, took breath and dived once more. Thus passed a few minutes of unspeakable anguish, which all his philosophy could not overcome, for he thought, all the while, that he heard behind him the sound of those huge jaws ready to snap him up forever. In this state of mind, he was striking out under the water as noiselessly as possible, when he felt himself seized by the arm, and then by the waist. Poor Joe, he gave one last thought to his master, and began to struggle with all the energy of despair, feeling himself the while drawn along, but not toward the bottom of the lake, as is the habit of the crocodile when about to devour its prey, but toward the surface. So soon as he could get breath and look around him, he saw that he was between two natives as black as ebony, who held him with a firm grip and uttered strange cries. "Ha," said Joe, "blacks instead of crocodiles. Well, I prefer it as it is, but how in the mischief dare these fellows go in bathing in such places?" Joe was not aware that the inhabitants of the islands of Lake Teach had, like many other Negro tribes, plunged with impunity into sheets of water infested with crocodiles and caimans, and without troubling their heads about them. The amphibious denizens of this lake enjoy the well-deserved reputation of being quite inoffensive. But had not Joe escaped one peril only to fall into another? That was a question which he left events to decide, and since he could not do otherwise, he allowed himself to be conducted to the shore without manifesting any alarm. Evidently, thought he, these chaps saw the Victoria skimming the waters of the lake like a monster of the air. They were the distant witnesses of my tumble, and they can't fail to have some respect for a man that fell from the sky. Let them have their own way then. Joe was at this stage of his meditations when he was landed amid a yelling crowd of both sexes, and all ages and sizes, but not of all colours. In fine, he was surrounded by a tribe of bidyamas as black as jet. Nor had he to blush for the scantiness of his costume, for he saw that he was in undress in the highest style of that country. But before he had time to form an exact idea of the situation, there was no mistaking the agitation of which he instantly became the object, and this soon enabled him to pluck up courage, although the adventure of Kaze did come back rather vividly to his memory. "I foresee that they are going to make a god of me again," thought he, "some son of the moon most likely. Well, one trade is as good as another when a man has no choice. The main thing is to gain time. Should the Victoria pass this way again, I'll take advantage of my new position to treat my worshippers here to a miracle when I go sailing up into the sky." While Joe's thoughts were running thus, the throng pressed around him. They prostrated themselves before him, they howled, they felt him, they became even annoyingly familiar, but at the same time they had the consideration to offer him a superb banquet consisting of sour milk and rice pounded in honey. The worthy fellow, making the best of everything, took one of the heartiest luncheons he ever ate in his life, and gave his new adorers an exalted idea of how the gods tuck away their food upon grand occasions. When evening came, the sorcerers of the island took him respectfully by the hand, and conducted him to a sort of house surrounded with talismans. But as he was entering it, Joe cast an uneasy look at the heaps of human bones that lay scattered around this sanctuary. But he had still more time to think about them when he found himself at last shut up in the cabin. During the evening and through a part of the night, he heard festive chantings, the reverberations of a kind of drum, and a clatter of old iron, which were very sweet, no doubt, to African ears. Then there were howling choruses, accompanied by endless dances by gangs of natives who circled round and round the sacred hut with contortions and grimaces. Joe could catch the sound of this deafening orchestra through the mud and reeds of which his cabin was built, and perhaps under other circumstances he might have been amused by these strange ceremonies, but his mind was soon disturbed by quite different and less agreeable reflections. Even looking at the bright side of things, he found it both stupid and sad to be left alone in the midst of this savage country and among these wild tribes. Few travellers who had penetrated to these regions had ever again seen their native land. Moreover, could he trust to the worship of which he saw himself the object? He had good reason to believe in the vanity of human greatness, and he asked himself whether in this country adoration did not sometimes go to the length of eating the object adored. But notwithstanding this rather perplexing prospect, after some hours of meditation, fatigue got the better of his gloomy thoughts, and Joe fell into a profound slumber, which would have lasted no doubt until sunrise, had not a very unexpected sensation of dampness awakened the sleeper. Ere long this dampness became water, and that water gained so rapidly that it had soon mounted to Joe's waist. "What can this be?" said he. "A flood, a water-spout, or a new torture invented by these blacks? Faith, though, I'm not going to wait here till it's up to my neck." And so saying, he burst through the frail wall with a jog of his powerful shoulder and found himself, where, in the open lake, island there was none, it had sunk during the night, in its place the watery immensity of Lake Teachad. "A poor country for the landowners," said Joe, once more vigorously resorting to his skill in the art of natation. One of those phenomena, which are by no means unusual on Lake Teachad, had liberated our brave Joe. More than one island that previously seemed to have the solidity of rock has been submerged in this way, and the people living along the shores of the mainland have had to pick up the unfortunate survivors of these terrible catastrophes. Joe knew nothing about this peculiarity of the region, but he was none the less ready to profit by it. He caught sight of a boat drifting about without occupants and was soon aboard of it. He found it to be but the trunk of a tree rudely hollowed out, but there were a couple of paddles in it, and Joe, availing himself of a rapid current, allowed his craft to float along. "But let us see where we are," he said. "The polar star there, that does its work honourably in pointing out the direction due north to everybody else, will most likely do me that service." He discovered with satisfaction that the current was taking him toward the northern shore of the lake, and he allowed himself to glide with it. About 2 o'clock in the morning he disembarked upon a promontory covered with prickly reeds, that proved very provoking and inconvenient even to a philosopher like him. But a tree grew there expressly to offer him a bed among its branches, and Joe climbed up into it for greater security, and there, without sleeping much however, awaited the dawn of day. When morning had come with that suddenness which is peculiar to the equatorial regions, Joe cast a glance at the tree which had sheltered him during the last few hours, and beheld a sight that chilled the marrow in his bones. The branches of the tree were literally covered with snakes and chameleons. The foliage actually was hidden beneath their coils, so that the beholder might have fancied that he saw before him a new kind of tree that bore reptiles for its leaves and fruit. And all this horrible living mass writhed and twisted in the first rays of the morning sun. Joe experienced a keen sensation or terror mingled with disgust as he looked at it, and he leaped precipitately from the tree amid the hissings of these new and unwelcome bedfellows. "Now there's something that I would never have believed," said he. He was not aware that Dr. Vogel's last letters had made known this singular feature of the shores of Lake Teachad, where reptiles are more numerous than in any other part of the world. But after what he had just seen, Joe determined to be more circumspect for the future, and taking his bearings by the sun, he set off afoot toward the northeast, avoiding with the utmost care cabins, huts, hovels and dens of every description that might serve in any manner as a shelter for human beings. How often his gaze was turned upward to the sky. He hoped to catch a glimpse each time of the Victoria, and although he looked vainly during all that long, fatiguing day of sore-foot travel, his confident reliance on his master remained undiminished. Great energy of character was needed to enable him thus to sustain the situation with philosophy. Hunger conspired with fatigue to crush him, for a man's system is not greatly restored and fortified by a diet of roots, the pith of plants, such as the meal or the fruit of the down palm tree. And yet, according to his own calculations, Joe was enabled to push on about 20 miles to the westward. His body bore in scores of places the marks of the thorns with which the lake reeds, the acacias, the mimosas, and other wild shrubbery through which he had to force his way, are thickly studded, and his torn and bleeding feet rendered walking both painful and difficult. But at length he managed to react against all these sufferings, and when evening came again, he resolved to pass the night on the shores of Lake Teachad. There he had to endure the bites of myriads of insects. Gnats, mosquitoes, ants half an inch long, literally covered the ground. And in less than 2 hours, Joe had not a rag remaining of the garments that had covered him, the insects having devoured them. It was a terrible night that did not yield our exhausted traveller an hour of sleep. During all this time, the wild boars and native buffaloes, reinforced by the ajaub, a very dangerous species of lamantine, carried on their ferocious revels in the bushes and under the waters of the lake, filling the night with a hideous concert. Joe dared scarcely breathe. Even his courage and coolness had hard work to bear up against so terrible a situation. At length day came again, and Joe sprang to his feet precipitately, but judge of the loathing he felt when he saw what species of creature had shared his couch. A toad. But a toad 5 inches in length, a monstrous, repulsive specimen of vermin that sat there staring at him with huge round eyes. Joe felt his stomach revolt at the sight, and regaining a little strength from the intensity of his repugnance, he rushed at the top of his speed and plunged into the lake. This sudden bath somewhat allayed the pangs of the itching that tortured his whole body, and chewing a few leaves, he set forth resolutely, again feeling an obstinate resolution in the act, for which he could hardly account even to his own mind. He no longer seemed to have entire control of his own acts, and nevertheless he felt within him a strength superior to despair. However, he began now to suffer terribly from hunger. His stomach, less resigned than he was, rebelled, and he was obliged to fasten a tendril of wild vine tightly about his waist. Fortunately, he could quench his thirst at any moment, and in recalling the sufferings he had undergone in the desert, he experienced comparative relief in his exemption from that other distressing want. What can have become of the Victoria? He wondered. The wind blows from the north, and she should be carried back by it toward the lake. No doubt the doctor has gone to work to right her balance, but yesterday would have given him time enough for that, so that may be today. But I must act just as if I was never to see him again. After all, if I only get to one of the large towns on the lake, I'll find myself no worse off than the travellers my master used to talk about. Why shouldn't I work my way out of the scrape as well as they did? Some of them got back home again. Come then, the deuce, cheer up, my boy. Thus talking to himself and walking on rapidly, Joe came right upon a horde of natives in the very depths of the forest, but he halted in time and was not seen by them. The Negroes were busy poisoning arrows with the juice of the euphorbium, a piece of work deemed a great affair among these savage tribes, and carried on with a sort of ceremonial solemnity. Joe, entirely motionless and even holding his breath, was keeping himself concealed in a thicket, when happening to raise his eyes, he saw through an opening in the foliage the welcome apparition of the balloon, the Victoria herself, moving toward the lake at a height of only about 100 feet above him. But he could not make himself heard. He dared not, could not make his friends even see him. Tears came to his eyes, not of grief but of thankfulness. His master was then seeking him. His master had not left him to perish. He would have to wait for the departure of the blacks. Then he could quit his hiding place and run toward the borders of Lake Teachad. But by this time the Victoria was disappearing in the distant sky. Joe still determined to wait for her. She would come back again, undoubtedly. She did indeed return, but farther to the eastward. Joe ran, gesticulated, shouted, but all in vain. A strong breeze was sweeping the balloon away with a speed that deprived him of all hope. For the first time, energy and confidence abandoned the heart of the unfortunate man. He saw that he was lost. He thought his master gone beyond all prospect of return. He dared no longer think, he would no longer reflect. Like a crazy man, his feet bleeding, his body cut and torn, he walked on during all that day and a part of the next night. He even dragged himself along, sometimes on his knees, sometimes with his hands. He saw the moment nigh when all his strength would fail, and nothing would be left to him but to sink upon the ground and die. Thus working his way along, he at length found himself close to a marsh, or what he knew would soon become a marsh, for night had set in some hours before, and he fell by a sudden misstep into a thick, clinging mire. In spite of all his efforts, in spite of his desperate struggles, he felt himself sinking gradually in the swampy ooze, and in a few minutes he was buried to his waist. Here then at last is death, he thought in agony, and what a death! He now began to struggle again like a madman, but his efforts only served to bury him deeper in the tomb that the poor doomed lad was hollowing for himself. Not a log of wood or a branch to buoy him up, not a reed to which he might cling. He felt that all was over, his eyes convulsively closed. "Master, master, help," were his last words, but his voice, despairing, unaided, half stifled already by the rising mire, died away feebly on the night. Chapter 36. A throng of people on the horizon, a troop of Arabs, the pursuit, it is he, fall from horseback, the strangled Arab, a ball from Kennedy, adroit manoeuvres caught up flying, Joe saved at last. From the moment when Kennedy resumed his post of observation in the front of the car, he had not ceased to watch the horizon with his utmost attention. After the lapse of some time, he turned toward the doctor and said, "If I am not greatly mistaken, I can see, off yonder in the distance, a throng of men or animals moving. It is impossible to make them out yet, but I observe that they are in violent motion, for they are raising a great cloud of dust." "May it not be another contrary breeze," said the doctor, "another whirlwind coming to drive us back northward again," and while speaking he stood up to examine the horizon. "I think not, Samuel, it is a troop of gazelles or of wild oxen,"